Ladies and gentlemen, it is a distinct honor for me to be invited by Shri to come and share thoughts with all of you here on the directions of India's foreign policy. For one, I must commend him and his energy and for organizing this function, and along with him, I commend his team also. This organization has displayed great zeal, great energy, and organizing ability. My compliments to him, of course, and congratulations, as also to his distinguished colleague, Mr. Mehta, who so generously introduced me in, I think, rather Eurojustic terms. I'm not what he says he is. I'm a very ordinary Indian, born in the desert of India. My district is the westernmost district of the country. It is Bardmer and Jaswant. Really not the best place to learn the finer points of foreign policy. Mr. Joly has asked me to speak on the contours of India's foreign policy. I have about 20 minutes in which to share my thoughts. To understand the contours of India's foreign policy, which really took shape along with India's independence, we have to go back, in reality, to the 20th century. And in the 20th century, the events that shaped the century and the future course of the globe were really confined between the consequences of two great conflicts, the First World War and the Second World War. The First World War resulted in the Sykes-Picot Pact and what was then termed by Wavell, a great viceroy who termed the agreements that were arrived at in the Treaty of Paris as the peace that ended all peace in the Middle East. First World War was also when the Baldwin Declaration came into effect, and countries got formed because of which Israel came into being. Palestine was divided, but also what then happened because of the Sykes-Picot Pact was the drawing of lines in sand and countries being born. The great Ottoman Empire ended, Saudi Arabia got born, Iraq came into being. These were at one time really only lines in sand. The other great conflict of the 20th century was the Second Great War, which really saw the most cataclysmic conclusion of war ever witnessed by mankind. That was the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now you would wonder why these had consequences for us. These were intricately, very closely related to the Indian foreign policy and its structures. If you reflect on the reality of the historical developments, and you'll find that India is sitting on the crossroads of four collapsed empires. And these collapsed empires are all the empires that collapsed in the 20th century. The first to collapse was the empire that China had, and the demise of the in about 1910, the Qing dynasty ended as the result that the eastern part of India became undefined and remained and has largely remained undefined till today. The Qing dynasty its end was a result of the Sun Yat-sen's revolution and the consequences that followed in People's Republic and the creation of People's Republic are what we are experiencing today. In about 1920s, the Second Great Empire ended which was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was really the Khalifa in those years, and Makkah, Medina were in their care. The demise of the Ottoman Empire released all these countries, because at one time even Egypt was a territory that was part under the control of the Ottomans. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire had a direct consequence with India, and that was the Mahatma Gandhi's association with the Ali brothers and Khilafat movement, Turkey abolishing the Khalifa, emergence of Saudi Arabia as the Khalifa of Makkah, Medina. The third empire that collapsed was really the British Empire in the middle of the 20th century. And with the collapse of the British Empire, the consequences that arose are with us today. And the last empire that collapsed in the 20th century was the Soviet Empire, of which the consequences are being experienced by still today. Now, why I paint this picture in very broad terms of the foundations on which India's foreign policy then got structured. It was as a consequence of the development of 20th centuries. Therefore, in the middle of the 20th century, when we gained independence, the policy adopted by late Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru of non-alignment was the appropriate approach for emerging India to place itself in a rapidly emerging post-colonial world. In that, after this non-alignment movement had gathered some space because of the personality of the last Prime Minister, of then Prime Minister, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, slowly the globe changed, and by the end of the 20th century, when the Soviet Empire collapsed, the Cold War ended, the relevance of non-alignment really ended with that. The non-alignment also had a very severe test, that I think was the principal test, in 1962. I was in uniform in 1962 and was serving at that year in the Northeast. I cannot explain to you or share with you the agony as a young soldier we felt of the consequences of the defeat in the Northeast. The direct consequence of that defeat was that non-alignment really died on the height of Sela and Bombdela, or on the bleak plateau of Aksai Chin. With that non-alignment having been born, and Panditji's rather pathetic letters that he then wrote to US President then, they are worthy of examination because they make very sad reading. After 1962 and the deaths, or really in reality death of on alignment, the emergence of an alternative thought took a long time, inevitably, and it was not until Mr. Bajpayee's government, which then governed for 6 years, came into office that we were able to formulate an alternative position on global relations and foreign policy. I won't go into the details of that foreign policy, but very broadly explained, it would be that it is a sovereign foreign policy that places direct and premier interest on India's national interest. You would appreciate that in the height of non-aligned days, even during 1971, when the globe faced the worst kind of genocide that Bengal had seen, and with that, what we witnessed was that there were 11 vetoes used by the then Soviet Union to prevent a condemnation of India's relief action in what is now Bangladesh. And then the United States of America actually took the whole matter to the General Assembly, where in General Assembly there is no provision for a mandatory action. And India's position was, we had only 7 nations in the world that stood by us in 71. 110 voted against India. This must change. And these were the demands on our foreign policy that Vajpayee ji had to face. We also had to face the consequences of nuclear apartheid. I term it as nuclear apartheid because the 5 nuclear countries, who were also the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, they had appropriated to themselves the right to have nuclear weapons. We asserted and continue to assert that the right to national security is a nation's inherent right. You cannot define it or confine it only to 5 countries in the world. These 5 are now the permanent members of the UN Security Council. It is an astonishing, rather astounding, in fact, but it is a fact that when at the formation of the Security Council, India was offered a seat. Late Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru said it would be unfair for India to occupy a seat in the Security Council whilst China does not. And China in those years had not been recognized. It was Formosa that was considered as China. Now these kind of anomalies, if I went into, I would far exceed my time. Therefore, what is the direction that India's foreign policy now has? Succinctly, I will describe it that today, because of the policy structures of the UPA government, also preceding that, the Congress government, India's foreign policy had got confined within, in reality, within 4 lines. There is the McMahon line, there is the Durand line, the line of actual control, and the line of control. These 4 lines have now constricted India's foreign policy, and for so long as India remains constricted within these 4 lines, its foreign policy will not be able to really impress its options, impress its India's personality and India's footprint on the rest of the international community. The present government that has been in governance for the last 10 years, if I were to carry out a very brief audit of its performance of foreign policy, I'm afraid I will have to point out that never in the last 65 years, 66 years of India's independence, have we had a situation in which India finds itself at a kind of a position in which our entire neighborhood is turbulent, our entire neighborhood finds itself at odds with India, and we have not been able to resolve our problems with any of them. We have problems at the moment with even with Nepal. We have problems with Sri Lanka. We have problems, of course, with Pakistan. We have problems with China. And today the world, as it is faced today, is deeply troubled by the global situation. If you reflect for a moment on how the center of gravity of conflicts post-World War II has shifted from Europe to Asia and is currently focused in what is broadly called West Asia, you would realize that the gravitational center of global conflicts has shifted from Europe to our vicinity. Pakistan is in trouble. In 2014, the current year, Afghanistan has to have a new election, it has to have a new president, and it has to cope with the situation of US and NATO withdrawal from their land. You have to see the consequences of American strained and saddened to have to point out that in the face of these challenges, the management of India's foreign policy by the present UPA government has really brought great problems on our doorsteps. They are now in the evening of their existence in government, but now they in reality are not in a position to correct any of these. It will devolve on the successor government to find answers to these, and it is a very difficult situation in foreign policy terms where India finds itself. It is quite often said that the defense budget is the price that a country pays for its foreign policy. And it's in very real terms what we are paying for our defense, having a two-front confrontational approach between China and Pakistan, and the oceans also being troubled now, Sri Lanka at standoff, Nepal distanced. It is a very difficult situation that India has been landed by the present government. I have a lot more to say, but I don't think it is possible for me to continue because I must abide by the time that is available for this discussion. I thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for having taken the trouble to come here. The non-resident Indians, I might remind you that it was Mr. Bajpayee's government that had established a ministry for the non-resident Indians. And the very first chairman of this was late Dr. Lakshmiwal Singh. And he is the one who said rather than non-resident Indians, it should be Pravasi Bharatiya. And that is the name that got adopted. You are really, all of you are great strength and a great wealth of India. All of you really are ambassadors of India, wherever and whichever country you may be serving or living or as citizens of that country. I remember President Clinton once telling me that we have had in the last 3 years, that was then roughly around 2003, I think, that for the last 3 years I have found that Indian students have acquired the first 3 positions in our assessments. Of the 22 countries that constitute the United States, India has continued to be at the top of our assessments. Less than 1% of US population controls 8% of US wealth. You as Pravasi Bharatis today occupy the highest seats in the offices of the United States of America and whatever other countries that you find residence or nationality in. You are India's great strength. You are India's unnamed ambassadors, and your continued linkage with India is a linkage that recharges your batteries. But along with recharging your batteries, we are also strengthened and greatly recharged by your presence here. I do commend Mr. Jolly, and I congratulate him for having organized this function with so much energy and such great success. Thank you very much, Mr. Jolly, and thank you very much, ladies.